Better? Okay. My name is Terry Watson, and I'm an assistant professor at the City College of New York. So Harlem is here. Harlem is here. So this session, Black Girls Matter, Public Scholarship Engaging with Race and Gender Interaction in Schools, will speak to the distinct biases based on gender and race that Black women and girls encounter in the places that we call schools. These challenges oftentimes serve to portray us at best as delinquent, angry, and oftentimes incompetent, while impeding our hopes and aspirations. With that in mind, I created this session for Black girls like my daughter, Taylor Falls, who will be attending Tufts University in the fall, and also for Kiera Wilmot, the 16-year-old Florida girl expelled for a harmless science experiment, and for Dejaria Becton, the 15-year-old Black girl tossed and pinned to the ground by a McKinney, Texas police officer during a pool party squabble, and also for Shakira, the 16-year-old Black girl who was dragged out of her seat and thrown across a South Carolina classroom over a cell phone. I just want to point out that this session actually began with the conversation that I had with Kimberly Crenshaw in the fall of 2014. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge Kimberly Crenshaw for the good work she has done, not just for us, but for Black women and girls across the nation. So let's take a moment and acknowledge her. And for those of you who don't know, Kimberly Crenshaw is a law professor at Columbia University and UCLA, so yes, the sister is bad. She's also the co-founder of the African American Policy Forum and the force behind the Say Her Name campaign, a gender-inclusive racial justice movement that campaigns against police brutality and the anti-Black violence against Black women in the United States. Last, I just want to acknowledge my good friend and brother, Dr. Ivory Tolson. Ivory is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Negro Education. The JNE was founded in 1932 for us and by us. Myself, Kimberly Crenshaw, Lori Patton Davis, and Chayla Haynes will serve as guest editors of a special issue of the JNE that will focus on the distinct challenges Black women and girls face in PK through 20 settings. Please look out for it in the fall, and thank you for listening. I now want to bring up my colleague, my good friend, April Peters Hawkins from the University of Georgia.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge Terry Watson, who actually contacted the Division A Vice President and then myself to actually do this presidential session, and encourage any of you who have good ideas to just ask. You never know what asking will get you. So we're here because of a great idea. I'm at the University of Georgia. I'm an assistant professor in ed leadership. I also want to thank our distinguished panel and our speaker of the hour. And my task here is to introduce her this morning. Before I do that, I also want to just say to you that we do have a hashtag or a Twitter feed that we would like for you to post to if you'd like to. It's hashtag AERA Black Girls Matter, so that you'll have that information. And we would look forward to later on reading your posts and your tweets. Now, the moment of the hour. So we'd like to just thank you, Melissa Harris Perry, for being here. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about her. She probably needs no introduction. If you're like me, you know a lot about her already, but I'd like to tell you just a little bit anyway. Melissa Harris Perry is the Maya Angelou Chair at Wake Forest University. There, she is the executive director of the Pro-Humanitate Institute and founding director of the Anna Julia Cooper Center on Gender, Race, and Politics in the South. She is the author of the award-winning Barbershops, Bibles, and BET, Everyday Talk and Black Political Thought, and Sister Citizen, Shame, Stereotypes, and Black Women in America. Melissa Harris Perry received her BA degree in English from Wake Forest University and her PhD degree in Political Science from Duke University. She also studied theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York. She previously served on the faculty of the University of Chicago, Princeton University, and Tulane University. So without further ado, please help me welcome to the stage Melissa Harris Perry.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here and to to have received such a lovely invitation. It's also particularly nice to be here with my team from the Anna Julia Cooper Center, who have done a tremendous amount of work in preparation for our time here, particularly two members of my team, my associate director, Dr. Danny Parker, who is also somehow the empress of AERA. So Dr. Parker and my executive liaison, Relisa Tutwiler. So both of them have been just tremendous in terms of the work they've done to get us here. So we have really sort of two pieces of our work today. One is I'm going to try to set up sort of a framework for our thinking, and then really open up for a conversation with our panelists. Think of it as an extended MHP show with no commercial breaks, where I'll do a, so I'll do the PowerPoint as a way of kind of trying to think about, what might a historical and contemporary kind of theoretical framework for thinking about what the big issues of Black Girls Matter might look like, and then really turn it over to the experts in various fields of education to try to, really drill down into thinking about what it would mean to ask that question or to assert that reality of Black girls mattering within this academic field. So let me walk through this part as swiftly as possible and not get too enamored of my own words, so I'll watch my time a little bit here. Okay. So maybe I have to use the clicker. Bizarro, okay. Sorry. Okay, here we go. All right, so let me just, I'm going to start with this assertion. And that is that I actually think we regularly tell the historical narratives of violence against Black boys and the ways that that violence is connected to our collective movements for racial justice and social change. I was thinking about this probably most recently in the context of having a conversation with, oh, you can't hear me? All right, I'll scooch up to the mic. I was thinking about this most recently in the context of having a conversation with Professor Anita Hill. And the ways that Professor Hill was saying to me she felt irritated when Clarence Thomas invoked the language of lynching. Now, there were multiple levels of her irritation, as you might imagine. It's nice to know that she was irritated. She held it so tightly that you didn't necessarily know in that moment 25 years ago. Part of it is that her own grandfather was threatened with an actual lynching, and so the discourse of high-tech lynching felt disingenuous to her. Part of it is, of course, as we know, that no posse of white men ever got together to protect a Black woman from sexual assault. But part of it is also that there isn't kind of an easily available trope that Black women can use for talking about our experiences, right? What was it that she was experiencing? A high-tech, right. So the availability that Thomas had to use the discourse of lynching is in part because we actually regularly tell the narrative of violence against Black boys in a way that allows us access to it so that when, for example, Thomas can say high-tech lynching, we're like, well, we are against that. Right? We know what Black male vulnerability in the face of a white male power structure looks like. We know that that is a thing called lynching. We know that we are against that. And so you end up with this weird thing where 50% of African Americans end up supporting Clarence Thomas's confirmation to the Supreme Court 25 years ago. He does not have 50% approval ratings among African Americans now, right? So on the one hand, we have access to this discourse, access which is important, but also can be troubling because we less frequently and fully acknowledge the various forms of historical violence against Black girls and the connection of that violence to our movements for racial inequality and social justice, right? So I'm not asking us to, right, jettison our lynching understandings. In fact, I'd want us to more fully understand precisely what they are, but rather that we also have access to violence against girls and women. Specifically, I want us to think a little bit in this context, because we're at AERA, about violence against Black schoolgirls, just for a second. So I want us to think for a minute about Elizabeth Eckford in 1957. You guys know the story about this picture, of course, and that what looks like all women, adult women yelling at her, is in fact also another schoolgirl, that's Hazel there behind her, yelling. She's in fact the same age. But I think maybe because my daughter is going to high school next year, the girlhood of Elizabeth Eckford is highly available to me, maybe in ways that when I myself was a girl, I thought of Elizabeth as older. We think of them as the civil rights warriors, and so it can be easy to forget to think of them as girls, to think of this as some kind of civil rights moment as opposed to going to school in the morning, to forget that part of the reason that Elizabeth is here in this place but nobody else is because of the intersection not only of her Blackness and her girlhood, but also her relative poverty as compared to the other Little Rock Nine, because Elizabeth doesn't have a phone. So the other kids in the cohort all have home phones, and so when they change where they're going to meet, all the other kids know where to meet Daisy Bates, but Elizabeth, being the least economically well-off, the most economically marginal, doesn't have a phone, she doesn't get the message, and so she ends up away from and therefore isolated. And so in this moment, it is the intersection of her girlhood, her race, and her relatively economically marginal status, which puts her in this space of violence. And just to imagine what it takes to enact this kind of racial supremacy over and against a girl trying to go to school. Or Ruby Bridges in 1960. What it means that a little teeny tiny person could be this vulnerable. That, one, it should remind us anytime we do this golden age of the ghetto narrative about segregation, few things irritate me more than, well, you know, at least back then, because it is always my presumption that if shit was fine, people would not have put their little tiny baby children in this kind of harm's way to get out of it. Like, I suppose if it was good and fine and really no big deal, because look, let me be clear. I am born in 1973, just on the immediate back end, because, you know, I grew up in Virginia, so we still had 2 swimming pools at the public swimming pool place, right? And my mother, who was from the West, was like, Bill, why are there 2 pools? And he'd be like, shh, Diana. So immediate post-integration. But I just always presume, this picture always helps me to understand that, like, no, if segregation was real, like, just fine, people would not have put their little teeny baby girl child in this kind of harm's way. So I presume it must not have been. And we don't always think of Addie Mae and Denise and Carol and Cynthia as schoolgirls, but not only are they schoolgirls in general, but they're in Sunday school. And so, you know, even the fact that that Ava's film begins with them, that we have to start Selma with the 4 of them talking about Coretta's hairstyle, that she has to remind us that the violence of the civil rights movement is enacted on girls doing girlhood action, talking about girlhood things on the way to Sunday school. And the jarring moment that Ava gives us at the start of Selma is the end of their lives in the rubble of the 16th Street Church on their way to school. And yet somehow we don't have access to this. There isn't a high-tech this that Anita can put her hands on in the moment that she is in front of Joe Biden and the rest of the Senate Confirmation Committee to push back against the high-tech lynching narrative that is available to Clarence Thomas. Let me even suggest that there is a certain kind of girlhood school violence that Michelle Robinson tells us about as late as 1980 at Princeton, where she writes about the Du Boisian double consciousness in her experience. I like to, the Anna Julia Cooper Center that I direct at Wake Forest, that I'm the founding director of, what we do is research around women and girls of color, and I keep trying to convince the White House that whatever else the First Lady is, she was a race-gender undergraduate researcher. Can I spin it or what? Right, because, at Princeton, all undergraduates are researchers, They all have to write a senior thesis, and so she writes a senior thesis, which really is about her kind of double consciousness experience, And she talks about these experiences of being, kind of having this double consciousness, a kind of intellectual violence, which is what I want to make a claim to here. So on the one hand, we have these experiences of violence at the same time that we have the reality that Black girls have always mattered. And particularly Black schoolgirls have consistently mattered in both their endurance of violence as well as in their activism and advocacy, which has often occurred either through education or on behalf of students or through education as a career and professional path. For any of a number of reasons. I mean, everybody knows what the Black middle class is built on, Post office and school teachers. Which means, of course, if you close all the post offices and end all the teachers' unions, okay. Y'all quiet, okay. You're just not from the South? Okay, all right, here we go. So Vivian Malone, I forgot to do this with Elizabeth Eckford. One of the things that always moves me about the Elizabeth Eckford photograph as well is, of course, that she made that dress herself, So again, at the intersections of her relative poverty and just the Southernness and the 1957 of it all, is that she made that skirt that she's wearing. Again, my daughter's about to go to high school, and the idea of her having made her own dress, my kid does know how to, she will find it online and she will put it in the basket and she will come downstairs and she will make herself a pest until I give her the credit card number. But the idea of that she made that, and that you put on your best. She's gonna go integrate Central High School, so she's wearing the dress that she made, What that means, that rejection of herself, even in this that she makes. Apparently, Vivian Malone was also a bit of a fashion plate. Look at her. She just, girl. I would like you to just go look at all of the pictures of Vivian Malone at all points in everything that she wears from 1960 forward. But, when the governor of Alabama stands in the schoolhouse door to tell Vivian Malone that she cannot come in, she's also standing there in a dress that she has made. It's always this sort of white supremacy is so funny in the face of Black excellence. It is so utterly ridiculous in the face of Black excellence. You're like, really, sir? Could you literally cannot see. Do you see what I made this, sir? So there we have Vivian Malone pushing through these doors, and we have Diane Nash just doing it. If we want to go back to Selma just for a minute, You know, it is important when you think about how much work, that Ava has to do even to put Diane in the story, right? Even to just have her there, but she's still relatively mute in comparison to what she actually does. So Diane is still, relative to who she in fact is to the Selma strategy, we still don't get the fullness of Diane's strategic genius. And it's so critically important to know that Diane finds her genius in the context of higher education, that she finds it in her HBCU space, that she finds it in college, that she finds it through campus and student activism initially, before then going on to like liberate the rest of us. But I love this image of her in part because we are reminded that she is as much schoolgirl and student as she is civil rights strategist. And Ella Baker, who is convinced of the capacity of students at all points to be not just part of the movement, but the primary leaders of our movement. And Shirley Chisholm, who in her sort of profoundly traditional versions of Black political empowerment, right, elected leadership, is nonetheless rooted in kind of an advocacy and work through Brooklyn, through her pre-K education, kindergarten focus, in the idea of education work, and particularly education work for the very young, as central to the work of Black politics. So in this moment, I think we have also forgotten, again, just to come back and to underline again, the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, and just, you know, like you can't even really, we could just spend the whole time on the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. She is, Kimberly Crenshaw is at this point a verb. You just Crenshaw on it. Because not only is she doing the work as an academic and an intellectual and an advocate and a policymaker and so profoundly unafraid to piss off everybody in order to stand in this work, but reminding us that sometimes it is the work of simply mapping, but then also mapping these multiple kinds of vulnerabilities, in this case, vulnerability to state violence, whether it is Rekia Boyd or Miriam Carey or Renisha McBride or Sandra Bland or Maya Hall, or all of the survivors of Holtzclaw, so that we are reminded that sometimes saying their names is not about after death, but even simply after violence that we survive. And we're also particularly reluctant to acknowledge all of the different kinds of violences against Black girls that Black girls are meant to endure. So yes, state violence, but one of the things about state violence is it can become almost too easy, not that it's easy, but almost too easy because it allows the bad guy to always be outside the community. And so we have to also be willing to acknowledge all of the violences within community, recognizing that those perpetrators sometimes mean that we have to, even in the context of movements for Black boys and men, also be willing to acknowledge that Black boys and men are sometimes also the perpetrators over and against Black girls and women. So just as in our history, the violence against Black girls is often perpetrated in schools. And we know that the violence is not subtle. And we know that the effects are not subtle. But we do know that some of the effects may escape our notice. So I just want to do one last thing here. So as much as we know some of the effects of violence against girls being about sexual assault and about corporal violence and about the sexual assault to prison pipeline, I want to draw our attention to one last kind of violence, and then I'll sit down, and that is violence against Black girls' minds. So this is just an idea I've been working on for relatively recently as, again, in part as a result of, I talked to Anita Hill, it just messed up my whole world. I haven't really been right since, but in a good way. As she's had me thinking a lot about this idea of well, I guess it wasn't just Anita Hill, it was also probably having people tell me as a person who's written 2 books about politics and holds a PhD in political science and has been teaching political science for 20 years, that I wasn't qualified to cover an election. That shit was very bizarre. So I've been thinking a little bit about, I mean, it was genuinely bizarre. Like, it was genuinely odd. Like, okay, sure. So I've been thinking a little bit about the question of a knowledge-based economy and what happens in a knowledge-based economy around questions of race and gender. So let me do this swiftly with a little bit of AJC at the beginning here. So we know that there's this wage gap, right? And I think we have lots of various conversations about the wage gap. This is the black girl, brown girl wage gap that I'm showing you here, as opposed to the typical 77-cent kind of all women wage gap. And we know that the wage gap has particularly powerful intersectional consequences around wealth for black and brown girls and women. So, for example, the wealth, the median wealth for African American single women being $0, right? Which is, that's your cushion in life if, if you get sick or if somebody else gets sick or if there's a downturn. So you have, in fact, zero cushion. And we know, in particular, around education, and I think this is the brutal one for those of us who are committed to education and who are educators, that in fact, education, particularly college education, does not provide either a short-term wealth protection or even a long-term wealth protection. Not only does it not reverse it, it actually makes it worse. So this is the really tough one here. So let's look at just the short term. This is just short-term wealth for college-educated African-American women. This is the downturn. Think of it this way, right? This is the economic downturn, 2007 to 2013. So this is the change in median real net worth, 2007 to 2013. Just look at the very last one. Just since we're doing just black girls, I would do Hispanic women for you if we were doing all people of color. But I just want you just to look at black girls down at the end. So what you'll see is that there is a greater median net worth loss, right? A greater change for college-educated, four-year college grads than for non-college grads. You see that? Right? Okay. So you look at that and you're like, oh, well, that's just a floor effect, right? That's just, they had more to lose, right? I mean, so you see that obviously they lost more during the downturn, and so you're like, oh, well, that sucks, but maybe that's just a floor effect because they had more to lose. Except, let's go all the way back to the good old days of Bill Clinton. So, pull my whole face together. Okay, so we go all the way back to 1992. Look at change in median real income. So this isn't even wealth. It's change in median real income between 92 and 2013 for four-year college grads and non-college grads. Look at just black girls at the end. So what I want you to see is that for non-college grads, there is an improvement. And for college grads, it gets worse. Now, when you pair those two things, the greater wealth loss during the downturn and the reduction in real income, there's actually a different set of stories to be told that isn't just about floor effects. It's actually about what's happening around education for black girls. And it is painful, and it is hard for us as folks who are ourselves educated, who believe that education is important, and who have been told over and over again that education is the ticket out. We can talk more about that in our conversation. part of what I want to suggest, there's obviously a lot of counterintuitive stuff here, but one thing is that presumably a knowledge economy is a counterintuitive moment because women ought to be doing, particularly women of color ought to be doing better, because if strength is less important, if it's not about like, can you build a big bridge, right? Women ought to be doing better because it ought to be more equitable, because it's just your brain. But what I want to suggest is actually the problem is that we don't think that what girls and women, particularly black girls and women, know, and the way that they come to know it, is particularly valuable. And we don't think that it can be traded very well on a marketplace of ideas. Just take a quick look at the STEM fields. Look at the kinds of experiences black women are now at the blue end, at the other side, the kinds of experiences that people report having. 77% of black women report having to provide evidence of more competence, of having colleagues suggest that they should work fewer hours, finding themselves having to play these stereotypical roles or being mistaken for administrative or custodial staff. I just was at Google and had to explain to people that if they get mistaken for custodial staff, they should say thank you. Because let me just say, my grandmother was a domestic worker, so of course I get mistaken for my grandma. Of course I look like my grandma. So if you tell me I look like the help, sure I do. Thank you. Because I guess I do look like my grandmother. Sure I do. What the fuck is wrong with you thinking that's a problem? So first, we should like check that moment a little bit in our heads about the fact that we have bought into the idea that thinking that the help are the problem, and then we could go from there. But anyway, we could talk about that in a second. Also, sir, the idea that what we know is so irrelevant that we can name black male genius as genius when there is a clear, purposeful erasure of all things written, thought, or spoken by black women, so that one can just shrug one's shoulders and be like, well, which I guess was maybe vaguely acceptable in 1972, no. Or 80, no, not really. Maybe in 93, yeah. But in 2016, damn. So that the idea of saying her name is not only about naming violence, naming death, but also, have you cited a black woman today? Because in fact, white boys and black boys did not have all the thoughts. So say her name in your footnotes. Say her name in your bibliography. Yeah, take a picture of that. Tweet that to Coates. Plant a little tweet or shade tree, feel free. I'll leave it up for a second. We got that? Okay, thank you. All right, I'll put it back up later if you'd like it. Okay, thank you. So, let us do a little something together here. Y'all just wake it on up. Come on, here we go. So let me just suggest that we could ask a feminist expert, we could make a syllabus, we could assign it and read it, we could follow black girl leadership, we could talk about how black girls code, how they rock, the extraordinary black girl leadership in the national conference that happened at Columbia this past weekend. We could support black women's organizing. We can think very broadly about who black women are and make sure that we are saying the names of all black women. Y'all can come on down to Wake Forest. No, you can't all come, but some of y'all can come on down to, we just don't, with this fire code, to the conference. We're trying to talk about Know Her Truth as a way of thinking about community engaged research. And I want to just basically open it up to our panel now to think about where we need to go from here. So you guys don't have bios or anything, right? So just so you know who's on our panel, Dr. Bettina Love is on our panel. Everybody probably already knows. Dr. Bettina from the University of Georgia. She and I have been together a bunch these days. You probably know that Dr. Love is at Harvard this year as a NAS fellow, which is just wonderful in like every possible way. but typically finds herself at the University of Georgia and is in many ways, I think, a model of what community-engaged research that puts Black girls and Black girl experience and knowledge and epistemology at the center really looks like. Dr. Lori Patton Davis, who's an associate professor in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program at Indiana University School of Education. And again, really thinking through questions here, importantly, of multiple intersections of both Black and queer identity in HBCU environments, and also really trying to get us to think very carefully about campus cultural centers in higher education. And so for me, I think, as we are thinking about questions of campus-based activism, and certainly in part, sort of this question of making sure that we have access to what education means for our big projects of social change. And Dr. Adrienne Dixon, Associate Professor of Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois College of Education, primary research interests in equity in urban schooling. Again, for me, really trying to think importantly about applying this question of critical race theory and thinking through what it means to do the work of local school policy for all of us who lived through the post-Katrina moment in New Orleans and watched policymakers take victory laps around our city while children were in environments that no one could possibly think were victorious if they'd spent 5 minutes actually in those schools. Your work has been critical, so it's a real pleasure to get to talk with this panel. To you guys. Let's start with, I am going to sit though in a sec. I want to just start with throwing open to you all, and I'll let you guys just grab the mic from one another. What questions might we ask if we actually started by putting Black girl experiences at the center of your field? So each of you are from very different fields within the context of education, but if we started by saying, I mean, if we just declared 2016 or 2017 the year of Black girls at the center of your field, what might look different in terms of the questions that would be generated in that field?
Hello, is this thing on? Okay. Good morning. So a couple of things that I think are important to think about relative to Black women and girls. And my work over the last 10 years has been looking at ed reform in post-Katrina New Orleans, and in particular, how community folks are making sense of those reforms. And so what's emerging is, one, the kind of vulnerabilities that Black women and girls have in an ed reform context. So how if we just looked at Katrina, but we could probably extrapolate out to other places that are being quote unquote reformed, the ways in which for Black women in the labor market, they are particularly vulnerable, and this is not only teachers and administrators, but paraprofessionals and so on, as the kind of landscape of public education is shifting dramatically and becoming privatized. So as Melissa talked about earlier, kind of places where Black people could penetrate the kind of middle class structure, those opportunities are no longer available. If folks started as kind of paraprofessionals, that career ladder is now almost not available for them in large part because now even teacher training in New Orleans, teacher training is even more privatized than it was before because now charter schools can create their own teacher training program. So universities are now out of the mix. You can opt into a university if you want, but now individual charter schools can license teachers. And those schools are becoming increasingly, or have been, pretty much all white staffs. So that's one place in the labor market that makes Black women particularly vulnerable. The other place is school discipline policies that we don't look at in terms of how Black girls are vulnerable not only to expulsion, but I would say in some ways really vulnerable to kind of potential sexual violence. So in New Orleans, in high schools, the schools that are zero tolerance policies and that have very strict discipline policies, black girls don't even have control over their own bodily functions in the sense that they can't travel unaccompanied to the bathroom. So if you're a young woman and it's that time of the month for you and you have to go to the bathroom, you have to be accompanied by security. Most in New Orleans, and this may be in other places, most of the security personnel are African American men, in large part because the staff are primarily white, and the way that they control these black bodies is by hiring young black men to serve as security officers and disciplinary officers. So when young women have to go to the bathroom, they can't go alone, they have to be accompanied. Now, I'm not saying that by virtue of being black men, they're prone, but it makes young black girls at risk of all kinds of things. And it's just disrespectful. Like, I can't even go to the bathroom alone and without permission, without being accompanied. So it's a layer of surveillance and disciplining that isn't necessarily applied to boys as well. It's different. And I think that we need to kind of consider how black girls experience these disciplinary policies differently that makes them particularly vulnerable in schools that are predominantly African American. So this isn't saying that in charter schools in New Orleans that white girls don't also experience this. In a place like New Orleans, and I would argue in New Jersey, in Memphis, in Camden, where reforms are happening in predominantly black schools and communities, that white girls are outside of this. This is not their experience. So girls of color in general are experiencing this kind of discipline, these kinds of disciplinary kind of practices and surveillance that's unique to them.
So there's two things I want to talk about, and good morning, everybody. This idea of civic education and how it leads to the spirit murdering of our young girls. So if you look at low performing and the metrics that they want to use for low performing, high poverty schools, there was a study in Chicago that researchers went into 135 classrooms. And in each of those classrooms, there was no civic education. And if there was any type of civic education, the idea of higher level thinking, questioning, ideas about democracy, freedom, liberty, justice, the idea that you can voice your concerns, the idea that you can speak up for yourself. Kids in low-performing schools do not get that type of education. So you are told to sit there, to be quiet, you can't go to the bathroom, you cannot move. So how in the world are you going to understand democracy if you never are told that you can be part of democracy? And so the ideas, so you have someone like Ella Baker and this idea of participatory democracy. Melissa, all the photos you showed are about black women and girls doing democracy. And so the idea that black folks have not been involved in democracy is, number one, a lie, it's hideous, and it devalues what we have done in this country for democracy. So since we have gotten here, then asked to come, the idea of freedom has always been on our minds.
Okay.
That's what we do as black folks. It's freedom. We're always looking for freedom, searching for freedom. And now we go to schools that are the first face of democracy. Schools are supposed to be places of justice, equality, liberal. That's what schools are supposed to be. We're supposed to be the good folks, right? We're supermen and women. We got the capes on our backs. Now, when you try to place schools in colonized land,
Well, there you go.
you try to place schools in a carceral state, you're going to get what we have now. And so you think about what happened to Sandra Bland. She's snatched out of her car. You think about what happened in South Carolina. This young girl is snatched out of her seat.
Well,
We have to start seeing those two things as the same. We have to start seeing schools not as school to prison pipeline, but a whole prison industrial complex that does not see a difference between the classroom and the streets. And we have to start framing schools in that way and helping teachers understand that. And I think, when we talk about teacher education programs, teacher education programs, number one, do not have classes on black girls, black girlhood. They barely have classes on race and diversity. And it's so episodic. This idea that we can have a class taught by the one person of color, and all your skin folk ain't your kinfolk. So we don't know what kind of education they're getting in that one class. And then we look for this type of education not to be episodic when they leave the classroom. And so there's so much teacher training that needs to be done about the experiences of black girls in a carceral state. I come from Atlanta, Georgia, where just 2 months ago, a black male teacher told his student all she did was raise her hand and ask a question. And this goes back again to the type of education our students are receiving and how they are viewed in the classroom. So they have to conform, they have to sit there, be still, and ask no questions. And when she asked a question, this black male teacher told her that you are no good. Let me get a quote. Let me go ahead and quote this man. Your purpose is to have sex and have children because you ain't gonna never be smart. That is what this black male teacher told this young girl in Georgia. She's a junior in high school. So we also gotta get out of this idea that blackness can save us and start thinking about teacher education that can really engage and care for black girls in ways in which they need, that can love them, that can support them, and can be deeply entrenched in ideas of participatory democracy. Because Ella Baker understood that. And this idea that we do not need leaders if we help people understand how to lead. So for me, it's all about having young girls understand that they have a civic duty to impact their classrooms, to change their schools, but they can't do that in the clerical state of education that is deeply embedded on surveillance, discipline, violence, and repression.
I would say within the realm of higher education, there is an overwhelming narrative that black women are doing just fine. And by that I mean that because they numerically outpace their male counterparts in terms of enrollment and graduation, there's this belief that they are some sort of new model minority, or that there really isn't a need to direct policy efforts or programmatic efforts to help these women succeed in college. I think when we look at the narrative, one problem is that we do graduate at higher numbers, but that information is decontextualized, meaning a large proportion of black women undergraduates graduate from for-profit institutions. And so, yes, that's certainly a degree, but the implications of that degree for wealth and future income is significantly problematic. And so I think some of the questions need to revolve around, where are black women in a lot of these discourses in college, one being sexual assault. When we think about sexual assault and campus violence, the face of that really is a white woman. We know very little about how black women and when black women deal with sexual assault violence on campus. When we look at where women are, there's not much conversation about why black women undermatch meaning they are certainly capable of attending a four-year institution, but choose a community college or a for-profit institution. We need to, I think, engage in questions around why Black women get, to quote Crenshaw, theoretically erased. So we're not featured in the curriculum in any particular way. We are not coaches, we are not faculty. If you look at the full professorship across the country, 1.26% are Black women. And so I'm more interested in not asking questions about how we fix Black women, because I think that's how it's always sort of situated. How can we fix these women and get them where they need to be? Yeah, right, mentor them. Versus, how do we fix a system that is terribly broken? And I'm glad Bettina mentioned schools of education, because when you think about the K through 12, in higher education, we're educating them to be teachers and administrators. We're educating them to go out in K through 12. And let me take that back. We're miseducating them and not even really including black girls and Black women's experiences in the curriculum or in any discourse that would prompt an educator to center them in the classroom rather than police them.
So let me pick up on that idea and then push it back through this, because I heard a little bit of it in each of the three comments. This idea that that schools of higher education in some way are educating the human beings who are then standing in front of K through 12 students. And I would like to put a question mark on the end of that. Maybe it was living in post-Katrina New Orleans. Maybe it is watching the public discourse around the end of unionized teachers as laborers. Part of it is just around the idea that teaching is itself not a professional activity, but one that can be engaged in primarily by enthusiastic young people on a part-time basis for a few years before they spend their time doing other more meaningful pursuits, like Wall Street, or whatever the hell it is they're going to do. And I actually also connect that a little bit to the question of civic education, right? So some of, Bettina, what you've identified are the very specific intersectional problems that do extraordinary violence to the persons, souls, spirits, generations of Black girls and women. Some of it is what's wrong, full stop. And so I guess part of what I'm wondering is strategically, politically, education policy-wise, how we intervene in both ways, right? So both centering Black girls in that story, but also saying, and maybe we haven't noticed, we haven't trained teachers, full stop, as a professional, that we've gotten to a point where we no longer think it is even something that requires professional training and long-term investment in the public space. That we seem to be shutting down public schools, that the notion of, that even what you talked about the idea about what a public school is and its engagement with civic education is ending and eroding for so much of the public, and Black girls taking the brunt of it, if that makes sense. So I just wanted to kind of push that back through all of these conversations.
I think that's a challenging question when we think about policies, and I'm going to talk from a higher ed lens. I think it's really difficult to get policymakers to just first and foremost see Black women as populations worth serving. There really is an invisibility around our needs, and the visibility comes when, again, at this intersectional space. So there's this belief that we might understand the experiences of Black women better by looking at what occurs for Black men, or we might understand the experiences of Black women better from a gender perspective if we look at white women. But there really isn't a space. And I mean, the legal system, as you know, is situated to ensure that Black women remain voiceless. So the act of resisting or the act of trying to create your own space becomes particularly challenging because there isn't a language. You know, there aren't these resources or they're just systemically, there aren't these things, whatever we'll call them, because they don't exist yet. There aren't these things that exist to center Black women in policy. So again, I think there are policies that exist, and to the extent possible that they may feature Black women. I can't think of any. That's a shame. But large scale, yeah, I think we're primarily missing from the policy discourse, unless it deals with welfare. See, I thought of one. If it deals with welfare or this belief that we're using the system, then Black women might get a little bit of airplay. But we also know that those sorts of things are situated within stereotypical ideas about who Black women are. So I'll leave it at that.
I think there's the invisibility juxtaposed to hypervisibility is a problem. So, you know, the ways in which Black girls perform in the classroom. So Black girls are in the classroom and they can be the teacher's assistant. They can, you know, they can be the mammy in the classroom. They can help grade the papers. You know, they're the help. And so they are the domestic workers in the classroom. And so the fact that when a teacher, Black teacher, white teacher, I don't care who this person who's supposed to be in the classroom to love that child cannot see that, that is a problem. And that problem surfaces in teacher education programs in the way we do teacher education programs. And we don't have the fortitude to have these type of tough conversations with our teachers. And so there is many policy implications that need to be addressed immediately. But there are things teacher education programs can do tomorrow. Tomorrow, right? If push out is not on your syllabus, there is a problem. Right? If you are not talking about these things, there is a problem. So I don't think teachers should be in the business of not waiting for policies. Teacher education programs should be in the business of creating policies and creating reform that the policymakers have to adhere to. And we have the ability to do that. And then also the ways in which we don't talk about explicit bias with teachers. No matter who you are, you see Black girls in a particular type of way, you don't understand their trauma, and you misread their trauma for behavioral problems. No one is talking with teachers about identifying when our young Black girls are victims of commercially trafficked sex crimes. Who's having that conversation with our teachers to say these are the clues you should be looking at to know that this is happening to that Black girl. That Black girl is not just acting out, she is in trauma. These are things that we could be implementing right now in teacher education programs. And that's not happening across the country. There's no class, there's no course, there's no book, there's no syllabus. Like there's nothing that a teacher educator can go to and say, hey, this is what I should be implementing in my class if I'm not up on this type of stuff. There should be deans, presidents who are thinking about this deeply and trying to help enforce this. So I do think there's many things we can do on a policy level, but I think there's so many things teacher ed programs can do right now at the start of the school year to really change the conversation and change the discourse around Black girls.
So I think there are kind of a couple things going on. When we think about the kind of the mainstream rhetoric about public education and the low quality of public education nationally, but in particular around New Orleans, but again, these places that are being reformed, the subtext is, because most of the teachers in these places that are being reformed, Memphis, New Orleans, I don't know about Camden in terms of the teacher force pre-reform, but the teacher force was primarily African American and female. Post-Katrina, and I would imagine my colleague Celia Rousseau is at the University of Memphis, and we're actually looking at a comparative piece because Memphis has used New Orleans as its template, and so they're adopting the reforms wholesale. They have a similar kind of structure with they have the Achievement School District, New Orleans had Recovery School District, so it's same players, just different location. So the subtext is that black women are inept and incapable of teaching and caring for black children. And you would have to accept that narrative. And so the rhetoric about the kind of success of the reforms assumes then that black women were not capable of teaching black children. And of course, we need to change the teaching force because they're not. We need 22-year-old white women who are not. They're not prepared to be teachers. They're not educated. They can just walk in off the street, and they're better than women who have given their lives to teaching. So that's the rhetoric. And then we have now this. So in New Orleans, the new kind of discourse is that we need to work together. There's a diversity problem that they created, right? That the reformers created. So now we need to recruit more teachers. But the energy, we need to recruit more teachers of color, but we're going to go specifically after African American men, because they're underrepresented. Nationally, black teachers only make up 7%, black teachers, male and female, make up 7% of the population. Depending on who you're talking to, black men are either 2 or 3%, which means black women are maybe 4 or 5%. It's not like we're, running things. So we're all underrepresented in our school districts, but our energy is to, when we talk about kind of diversifying the teacher force, is to increase the black male population. And and money just flies out. Like, we find all kind of money, and we can create all kind of programs to bring black men into the teaching field. And I think it creates, it just creates an imbalance, a rhetoric around imbalance that's just not accurate, and then pits us actually against each other. And that's not the fight, right? The fight is that we do need more teachers of color in the classroom. We do need programs that will prepare folks to teach our children. We do need that, and we don't need to be kind of fighting each other over that. And but the kind of public discourse is one that accepts that black women are inept, incapable, and not appropriate for being around our children. And that's a discourse that we clearly need to kind of address and change.
So I'm going to do one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to you all because there are mics in the audience, and let you guys get in. But I do want to do one more, and I think it's on trying to kind of think through what I was. I'm sorry, I have to one more though, Bettina, on your point about black girls being the domestic help in the classroom, because it's also true kind of in higher ed, right? So we're also the domestic help of higher ed, right? So we run, yeah. So I wanted you to, I felt like you undoubtedly, I wanted to give you that more so.
So I want to address that because I spoke about it in a session earlier this week. And so I watch a lot of reality TV, I won't lie. And I kept hearing this word thought. And decided I'm going to explore this language. What is a thought? And so I looked it up and found it was an acronym for, that hoe over there, right? And so I think in many ways, black women in the academy are situated as academic afterthoughts. And by thought, I mean the help is over there, or thanks for helping out today. So there's this dismissal and disposability that I believe black women administrators, faculty, and students feel in higher education, no matter the level. So I just want to put that out there, that we are helped throughout the educational pipeline, even as presidents and deans, when we get those roles.
I had suspected that you perhaps wanted to weigh in just for a moment on that. Yes, I can imagine. It was weighing on me too as I had submitted my budget this morning. Okay. I didn't quite mean to become a higher ed administrator. That just happened. Okay. I'm going to be thinking about thought. I'm just going to have a little thought bubble over my head the whole time I'm in my meeting tomorrow. Okay. So what I wanted to ask then was about intellectual violence for a second. And I wanted to ask about the idea of the things that Black girls and women know, and the ways that we value or devalue it. So again, not because we need to have some sort of gendered infighting, but I do think there's a way that the Black cool of Black masculinity, for all of the deeply troubling violence that occurs vis-a-vis Black men's bodies, there's also like a valuing of Black masculinity for the purposes of consumption, as troubling as that consumption is, that also travels along with the violence against Black male bodies, so that we see a desire to simultaneously destroy and eat, right? Destroy and consume Black masculinity in all of its kind of popular culture and athletic manifestations. So we see white men both wanting to kill and become Black men. In ways I'm not quite sure is always true about white women. I mean, there's a little bit going on with Black women's asses that is interesting over and across time and history, but particularly with Black women's minds, with what we know, with what our intellectual output is. Even the idea that Morrison herself can look at Coates's book. I mean, the reason I plant a shade tree over it is just literally my irritation that Morrison can look at a book that cites no woman, that thinks not at all about women's experience, that actively shrugs whenever the intersectional critique is offered and say, this is the thing. More that than the fact that, I mean, I think the book is useful in its own way, right? But the idea that our one shining light can look at that and be like, great. So I wonder if there is a way that there is something, some part of Black girl intellectual magic that we ought to be highlighting in the world, something that we ought to be saying, Black girls know, not in an essentialist way and not to be eaten by the world, but in order to generate within ourselves and within Black girls and women some kind of kernel of inherent, excited, self-possessed, self-enjoyment of our own intellectual contributions to the world. I'm not even quite sure what that would look like, but I'm wondering what you might imagine it would look like from your own space.
Okay. So at this moment, I have to say a name, and that name is Ruth Nicole Brown. And I think there's no one that I know who understands and can write and talk and express the magic of Black girls like Ruth Nicole Brown. And in her program, So Hot, it is this idea that Black girls are spontaneous, that we just create, that through African and African American creativity that just runs deeply within us, that we have the ability to heal ourselves. And I think for me, that is something that when Black girls are given the space, and that's number one, we have to be given the space. And I think that's what we see in schools is a taking of that space to heal, to reclaim, to understand who we are. Because my mentor says this, Dr. Cynthia Dillard, remembering is an act of decolonization. So when you remember who you are in a space, you are recalling and deeply, deeply resisting colonization. And so I think when Black girls get into spaces, that's when you see Black girls smiling and loving and double dutching and talking trash and getting in joy and Black joy. They're actually recalling who they are. They're remembering who they are. They're listening to their ancestors. There's love and there's joy. It's spontaneous. It's creative. And for me, I think we have to look at those examples of the spaces that have been created with programs around the country that are oftentimes out of school, but those programs that allow Black girls to express their creativity to heal. And I think healing has to be a huge part of this conversation because we all know of the statistical trauma. We can talk trauma all day, which is needed. Those statistics and that data is important. But when we find a space as researchers where there is healing and Black girls are being affirmed for who they are without all these tropes, that's a necessity. And so I think looking at the work of Ruth Nicole Brown and understanding when she talks about Black girlhood, Black girl frameworks, and the ideas in which they can be creative and what they create in those creative spaces is particularly important.
You want to go? Excuse me. So I hope my panelists don't get after me for this. I want to at least trouble for a second the notion of Black girl magic. And it's been done. There was a whole bunch of talk about it on the web. And I believe in the wonderful things that Black women do. In the words of Beyonce, we do slay all day. I get it. I love it. But what?
The whole thing happened. Did you see what you said? The whole thing happened.
Yeah. The hashtag in and of itself is wonderful. What I get concerned about is how people perceive it or how they take it. So they don't understand that the magic really is about all of our hard work, all of our efforts, all of the things that we put into what we do and who we are, and think that it just happens all of a sudden. And it's not that way. And so I want us to be thinking about the fact that, yes, people consume Black women's culture, whether it be hair, butts, all of these different things. They love some of the things that Black women represent, but they don't love Black women. Well, right. And so that's the issue when we think about Black girl magic. They love, what, for example, Michelle Obama stands for, but I'm not sure that they love her. And it becomes easy to position her or even some of us as this standard for Black women and girls without recognizing that it's not just, that Black women are, powerful. In many instances, we're powerless, or in some ways we're incomparable, but in a whole bunch of other ways we're incarcerated. Like there's a whole story, a more holistic way of thinking about Black women and what we contribute and our knowledge production. But we have to be careful about how those who don't really understand what it means to be a Black woman take that and co-opt it and turn it into something else to comfortably consume without recognizing that we're human, that we actually do exist. It's not magical in that sense. So,
I think for me, I'm interested in notions of resilience, but I struggle only because I don't have a better word for it. And I think resilience, in the context of Katrina, has been overused and used in ways that are not really helpful and helpful in terms of the way in which Black people have kind of coped with what's happened, but in a way that has celebrated kind of neoliberal reforms and the kind of neoliberal remaking of the city. But by way of a quick story, because I'm still kind of thinking about this, and I want to theorize on this resilience. I had been maybe 4 years into my project, and I shared this with some graduate students on whatever day we started, Friday, I think. We were 4 years in, I had to leave from Illinois, I was in New Orleans, and I was just depressed. I was like, fuck, like we losing, we keep losing, like these motherfuckers keep collecting W's and we just getting L's. And like, it's, you know what I mean? Like, goddamn, like we losing teachers, schools are closing, like what the fuck? Like these motherfuckers are winning. So it was very depressing for me, honestly. It was very depressing. I was like, how can I keep doing this? Like, I feel like I'm just documenting the L's, like, and there were so many layers to how the reforms were deeply entrenched, and it just didn't seem like we could penetrate. And in the morning, and it was a morning, I woke up because a parent had called me in a panic. She had been texting me and blowing up the phone. She was like, come down, we need you to come to Walter L. Cohen High School. Many of my in-laws had actually graduated from Walter L. Cohen. My family is from Uptown, so if you're familiar with New Orleans, it's Uptown. She said the kids walked out of school. And immediately I was like, Viva la Revolution! Like that was, yes! Yes, like finally, there's some hope. Like the hope was that even in the face of all this bullshit, you're closing schools, taking money, moving schools here, moving schools there. In Walter L. Cohen, it was a crying shame what they were doing to those kids. They didn't have working water faucets. The people who had taken over the building were bringing in bottles of water because the kids couldn't even use water faucets. The library was empty. No books. So the kids are like, well, what kind of book? There was no equipment in the chemistry lab. There wasn't anyone even teaching chemistry. The seniors were like, well, what are we going to do if we want to go to college? And the plan was to actually close Walter L. Cohen. And many of the kids had been in since freshmen, and not unlike other places, but in New Orleans, people are very faithful to their high schools. Right, and so generations will go to high schools. And if you go outside of whatever school your family went to, it's not a big thing, but typically families go to the same school. So these were kids who had looked forward to going to Walter L. Cohen. It meant something. Walter L. Cohen was an African-American man. It meant something to go there. And the kids said, well, what happens to homecoming? Are we even going to have homecoming? This was in October. And the fact that they got up and they were like, fuck this, we out. Like, they walked out. And the funny thing about, because this is millennials, right? They brought chairs with them because it was hot. And we're not standing outside now. We're going to sit. We're going to protest, but we are going to sit while we protest because it's hot. New Orleans is hot. But no one, we had no press. We tweeted everyone, CNN, we tweeted the local paper, which we knew the Times-Picayune wasn't gonna come, but we tweeted everyone. We couldn't get any press, and the kids were out there, and the insidiousness of it was that the adults called the police on the children, and there were many children who, 17, 18, and there are truancy laws in New Orleans, and being black and being vulnerable to the police state, it was a shame that we couldn't help kids kind of exercise and use this as a teachable moment. But what was encouraging to me was that the kids walked out and they started asking questions. Well, why are they closing our school? It turns out that the state had fallen short on what they had promised to a charter operator downtown at John Mack. And so the way that they were going to make up the money was to move these children from uptown to downtown. And the kids wanted to know how much it cost. And it was about $8,000 per kid. And so the kids said, so there's money on our backs? And they were like, ain't this like slavery? I ain't say it was like slavery, that's what the children said. They asked, right? So we're explaining to them. And the kids were like, well, guess what? We're not going back. Do they do this? How many times do they count us? Well, they count you in October, which is why they were closing the school October 1. And they count you in February. Guess what? We're not going to school in February. The kids organized this. And so that was the encouraging, that's the kind of resilience that I'm interested in, not the kind of trite resilience that people keep on going and they'll start their own school, because that doesn't hold the public, that doesn't hold the state accountable for the things that they do. When we operate outside of the state gets to continue doing the shit that they do, and we just have to make it happen on our own. No, we're not doing that. So the kids are like, no, we're gonna hold you accountable. You get money on our backs, guess what? You're not getting money off of us the next time. That's encouraging, and that's the piece that I want to kind of theorize on, because even outside of New Orleans, our schools, as horrible as many of the schools are, especially those that have been reformed, the kids go to school every day. Every day they get up and get on the bus and go to school. And despite the narrative of black kids not caring about their education or their mamas not caring, they send them to school every day. Every day. And I don't have this fully formed, but that's the kind of resilient, and we don't get credit. And Lisa Delpit said this in New Orleans, that there was a film on reform that glorified reform. This one mother had, her child was in 6th grade. He started in kindergarten. Every year he went to a new school. And Lisa said, this is a story about the fortitude of this mother. And so the narrative about black mothers who don't care about their children, this, in some ways, what we can pull out is that every year she had hope that there would be a better school, and she looked for it for her children. That's the kind of resilience that I think we don't think about, we don't theorize on, we don't document well enough outside of a neoliberal framework that continues to celebrate this kind of not holding the state accountable. And so again, that's kind of where I'm interested in terms of how are black women, because we carry the load. One little piece, there was a recent article about how black males experience poverty worse than anyone else. Well, actually, they're being cared for by black women, right? So to say that me being underpaid and that you experience poverty worse than I, who have to carry family members, many male, who can't find work, like that is a problem. But then I'm carrying the burden not only for the children, but for adult males who can't find work. That they're somehow suffering more? I don't think so. So this kind of get up every day, go look for a job knowing I'm not getting paid enough, that kind of resilience I think we don't think about, we don't theorize on, we don't document, we don't give black women credit for engaging in, and we're just supposed to suffer and long suffering and, oh, she's so strong, and so that's what I'm really interested in.
So I would invite folks to the mics. I think there's one certainly in these 2 aisles. I can't see to that aisle. Yes.
Thank you for your comments. I'm Beverly Lindsay, and I've been a tenured full professor, the first in history at the University of Georgia.
All right.
I'm also a tenured full professor at Penn State in the College of Education, and there are no other African American women in that position until last year. I'm a professor in higher education, international, and anthropology, and having been a dean twice. So my questions are twofold. One, knowing the rigors required for tenure and promotion, and that's what ultimately counts for academic positions, what do you suggest in terms of policy changes? And secondly, I mentioned international. Have you engaged, or are you planning to engage in some of these issues on an international basis?
I'll just say really quickly, when black women enter academia, we automatically do service. That's just what we do, right? We are asked, and we feel as though we have to have a commitment to our communities. So our white counterparts, they get a check for service, and they serve on a committee. That's their service. Our service is service to our communities. And we need deans and those on the P&T committees to understand that type of work. We don't see it as a burden, but it can be at times. But it is that we have this distinct commitment to our communities when we get into these positions that our other colleagues do not have. And that has to somehow be recognized, counted in the work that we do as black women as professors.
So, I mean, I'd underline that that on the tenure and promotion piece. I think there's, obviously there's lots of different pieces of this. Part of it is thinking of very different ways to count service, right? And so obviously part of what Bettina's acknowledging there is the checkmark problem, right? But I think there's multiple issues there. Some of it has to do with the sheer weight of on-campus service. Especially when you are the one or the only or one of a few. Part of it has to do with the epistemologies related to research that is community-engaged research, which sometimes is understood to be intellectually inferior to research from sometimes even secondary analysis of pre-gathered data, which is a bizarre way of understanding. So this is in part my point about sort of what people know and how we value it. For me, part of the answer to that, and it's a very small part, and it's one that, again, puts even more burden on the few folks of that 1.26%, but it's just been so critical to me in my own career, is that as we think about kind of the full arc of a academic career, there comes a point where part of what we do is institution building. And often a lot of our institution building happens on our campuses. But I think about how valuable the institution building of some of the largely African-American male academics has been to my own career, because what they did was they built journals. And those journals became spaces where I, as a junior faculty member, published my first pieces. So I think about Manning's Souls, and I think even about Malife's, Journal of Black Studies. And look, quite honestly, without those journals where people understood what I was up to before the APSR gave a shit, but still don't give a shit about what I do, right? I wouldn't have had those early publications as a junior faculty member. But they also had limitations because they often weren't intersectional. And so I think there's a lot of work left to be done for all of us in terms of thinking about offering spaces for the publication of intersectional and community-engaged research going forward, because the very slow pace of change in the academy is still going to require journal publications in high-quality peer-reviewed journals, and so we are going to have to be the engines of creating some of those high-quality peer-reviewed journals that nonetheless get what some of this work is. And so I would just say, again, it is a tiny and very labor-intensive part of this, but I do think that will be part of it. I'm a domestic researcher, but I don't know for other folks.
I haven't done international work, but what I have tried to do in research and in collaboration is to work with scholars who are considering the ethnic identity differences among Black women. So a good colleague of mine, well, two, Amalia Dache-Gerbino and Jasmine Haywood, are both working on scholarship that looks at Afro-Latina scholars, women scholars and women students. And Kimberly Griffin at University of Maryland is looking at not just Black women wholesale, but Black women who are Caribbean, who are from Africa. And so what does it mean to be in the US going to college in this space when you have an ethnic identity that doesn't really, hasn't fully identified as Black in a U.S. domestic sense. And so that's the extent of my work. I don't know if others, okay.
Yes, hi, thank you very much. It was just wonderful and inspirational. And Melissa, let me say that I was a regular watcher on the weekends, and I'm very disappointed, and I am rebelling. During the time you're on, I'm watching Fox News, and it's a really difficult rebellion. So as a researcher and someone who's been quite often in South Africa and the United States, comparing schools and race in South Africa as compared to the United States, I've had a lot of great support from so many people in the academy and other educators. But I wonder, 10 years from now, will we have a panel called Muslim Girls Matter? And are we at the point when we should even get ahead of the curve with that? Because we weren't with Black girls. And maybe I don't even need an answer because I'm reflecting on this myself. Do we need something to protect people who are not only marginalized now, but may very well be the new victims?
Well, let me just say, so I don't think that new victimization requires the end or ever necessarily goes hand in hand with the end of victimization for prior groups. So I think we see that, for example, let me back up. Often when I do long lectures around, for example, Black Lives Matter, one of the things that I'll do is I'll trouble the idea of Blackness so that we are having very expansive definitions of what Blackness means. I get into trouble sometimes with how expansive my definitions are. One space is to think about how Du Bois, even at the turn of the century, defines Blackness as this notion of being a problem. So he says, He says that it's not simply having a problem. To have problems is the human condition. All persons have problems. But that to be Black is to be a problem. So how does it feel to be a problem? That to enter into public space, in that space, to actually generate a problem. So think about the kinds of bodies that create problems simply by existing. So at the turn of the century for Du Bois, if the problem of the color line, if the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, then Blackness is the kind of discursive tool he uses to talk about being a problem. But think about right now, HB2 in North Carolina, the problematic body is the transgender body that enters into the bathroom space, right? On September 12th in Washington, D.C., or in New York, the problematic body might actually be a sick male body that is misidentified as a Muslim body because of wearing a turban and misidentified, or could be a hijab-wearing Muslim woman's body. A disabled body might be understood as a problematic body. A body seeking termination of a pregnancy in a county that has no Planned Parenthood could be a problematic body. And so by that broadest definition of Blackness, they take on what Cohn might call an ontological Blackness. What I'm not trying to make a claim towards there is that all of those experiences are equivalent to the American experience of being Black. I'm not trying to say that everybody has had intergenerational chattel slavery. I'm not trying to say everybody has experienced Jim Crow. I'm not trying to say that being undocumented in the US is the same thing as having, right? Let me be clear. What I am trying to say is that there is a version of this ontological definition of Blackness, a kind of Blackness as being so Catholic with a little c, that it encompasses an understanding of bodies that are problems. As a result, what we know also in the American experience is that over and over again, as a matter of public policy and of law, that when we have addressed the problem of Blackness, we have often entered into and changed the American social contract in ways that address Blackness, this ontological Blackness for everybody. Important example, and then I'll shut up, the 14th Amendment. So, at the end of the period of slavery and then Jim Crow, we realized there's no such thing as an American citizen, right? So it's 1866, and all you got is citizens of American states. You're a citizen of Georgia, or you're a citizen of Massachusetts, but don't nobody know what the hell an American citizen is. Not one freaking clue. At which point we figure out, oh shit, we better define this, because you know what? All these freedmen. So in order to solve the problem caused by the end of slavery, we write the 14th Amendment. And it turns out that what an American citizen is an individual who is born in this space, subject to this jurisdiction, who has due process and equal protection. That is literally when we decide what an American citizen is in 1866. We figure it out for Black folks. Everybody gets it. Every damn person gets it, right? Now, think about that. Think about what Mr. Trump is mad about right now. It's about the 14th Amendment, right? Amen. But that thing that we figured out in that moment to solve the problem addressed by Blackness, right, is actually a solution to all the ontological Blacknesses that emerge thereafter. So yes, should we be talking about hijab-wearing Muslim girls? Yeah, but are we? Yup. We actually are talking about that in that space, not because we're talking about their specified experience, because we're not quite, but what I will say is that this question of you are good not for speaking in this space, but for shutting up in this space that Bettina just offered to us about the Black girl in Georgia is in fact it stands in also for the you are not good for this, So in fact, we will need to have specified experiences and discussions around the specified and important versions of Blackness, but I don't necessarily think we're behind the curve or that we should shut up about Black girls while we do it, but that we should just have a broad definition of Blackness as we do it. We'll take one more. Actually, we'll take two more. We're not gonna silence the Black girl. So we'll take these last two. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jeff Kennedy. I'm an education advocate, activist, scholar. I too share some of the spaces and had the opportunity to learn from many of the individuals that I went to Union Theological also, as Melissa did. And I actually had a long time to spend with her uncle before she married into the family. So let me just say this. Currently in Washington, D.C., as most of you know, we have some of what we call this reform going on from Michelle Reed, Kaya Henderson, and formerly Mayor Adrian Fenty. Luckily, Adrian Fenty and Michelle Reed are no longer here, and hopefully we can get an indictment. Oh, excuse me, can you hear me now? Everybody hear me? Okay. So my statement was, we've had some of this reform that you've talked about all across the country, being led by Adrian Fenty, Kevin Shavers, different people, Robert Bobb from Detroit, that has come out of Washington, D.C., out of the spaces that we occupy. Luckily, we don't have Adrian Fenty any longer. Michelle Reed is gone. And hopefully we can get an indictment on Kaya Henderson. So when we look at where we are in education in this country, and I'd like to thank the sister earlier when she was talking about taking losses, going backwards, being able to count, and that African-American females only occupy 1%. 1%. Black males only occupy, 4 or 5% of the spaces where we do it. Who's educating our children? Who's teaching them to hate themselves, as Malcolm said? And so the question comes to the audience. I have the opportunity to meet with U.S. senators through the U.S. Senate Chaplain Barry Black's office. So we've had the opportunity to talk about educational policy. When is this scholarly activity going to start meeting Capitol Hill? Because we only have one black chief of staff in the whole Senate, and that's Senator Scott's.
Well, the Anna Julia Cooper Center was there this morning on Capitol Hill before we came here. And so, there's a new congressional caucus on black girls and women. So if you ask when it's going to meet it, I would say we did about 3 hours ago. In fact, on the 28th, we're going to have that congressional caucus is going to have a hearing about the state of black girls and women. We're going to enter that hearing on the state of black girls and women into the congressional record. Out of that, we are going to have a series of research that will become a call for papers around a series of research journals. We will be calling on many of you to submit. Anna Julia Cooper Center is actually going to connect. Kim Crenshaw will obviously be one of the top people, and her set of researchers out of AAPF will be among the top folks who will be connected with that congressional caucus, as well as AJC and some other organizations around the country who have been doing this work from a scholarly perspective. And the goal will be to start drawing in all of this work and pushing it out to both state legislative operations as well as federal ones. The Senate is a hot mess, but I will say the safest seat to have in terms of the House is a CBC seat. And so although we know that the administration in the White House is over in a matter of months, sad, but we know that the CBC will be around. So the answer is we are planning to make those intersections soon.
Hi, I just need to say that this has been so good for my spirit, so thank you.
Thank you.
And my weekends have not been the same, and I'm not watching Fox, so. But yeah, I just need to put that out there. I don't watch anything now. I'm hurt. I'm angry. All right. So I am a second-year teacher in Baltimore City. I teach at Roland Park Elementary Middle School. I actually have my student here today with me. He presented with me earlier. And so quick background on my school, it's 45% white, 45% black, and 10% other, middle and high school altogether. And so it's one of the most diverse in Baltimore, but the staff does not reflect that at all. So in the elementary school, there are no black or brown lead teachers. And in the middle school, I think there's maybe 7 of us or 8. So I was taking everything in when you all were talking about how our black girls should be treated in class and giving them their voice. And I try so hard to do that. And it's hard to do when you don't have that as a staff member. And so I'm just trying to get some advice on how to navigate that. None of the leaders above me, my assistant principal, my team leader, or my principal are of color. They're all white. 2 are male, 1 is female. And so I'm trying to figure out how to navigate that and give my students more of that, because I know they need it, but I don't have that either. So, and it's often like, oh, Nadira is the angry black teacher. And it's like, I'm just pointing out the obvious things that are happening that we all should know. And so also not to be the black teacher that also has to point everything out to them, or plan all the diversity meetings, or head the diversity club for students. So what can I do? And I'm a young black teacher and a female. And so I'm often, by my AP, things are often mansplained and white-splained to me, and you're like, no, I can do this. And then I'm often, trying to prove myself to them and prove that I am worthy of teaching this class. But my AP doesn't see that all the time. And parents, I meet with parents often about everything we're doing in my class. The first week of school, didn't know the students or the parents. Had a meeting with my principal and a parent because she didn't think I should have Black Lives Matter in my classroom. And I said, but this is the civil rights movement that is happening now, and we have a civil rights curriculum, so we have to talk about it. And so I'm just trying to figure out how to navigate all of that.
It sounds like you are. It sounds like you are doing it, right?
That's a lot, I'm sorry.
No, yes, ma'am. Go, please.
I know I'm not supposed to say much, but before coming to academia, I was a high school principal in Baltimore, Maryland. So I understand exactly what you're going through. And at the time I was named, I was the youngest sitting high school principal. I'm familiar with Roland Park. I want to first commend you on what you're doing, because as the kids say, the struggle is real. The struggle is real. And Baltimore is a very tough place to work as an educator. The public schools are no joke. I will say that it's an interesting space that you articulate, because at least at the high school level, when I did a dissertation on black women principals, because there aren't a lot of black women high school principals. I went to my first high school principal meeting, and everybody in there was a black woman. It's like, where were y'all when I was doing all this research? But I think one of the things that needs to happen is that you have to keep doing the work that you're doing. And as you continue to lead and gain the momentum with parents and students and with your colleagues, there's some things that people need to know about the experience of our kids, right? Because I think the disconnect is because there's so many people teaching our kids, but they're not doing that in a way that's culturally responsive. So there's this cultural disconnect in terms of what they know and understand, and the values that we then try to superimpose on people who are culturally different without valuing where they are and who they are. And so there's no easy answer and there's no quick fix. I'm a little bit surprised that in a school that's that diverse, the ultimate leadership in the city of Baltimore has not made strides to actually balance that, because that's one of the things that's needed. Our kids need to be able to look across their schools, at their leaders and their teachers, and see people that look like them and value them. And I don't think that the only way that can happen is for people that look like them. Some of the best educators I've met have not been racially the same as me, but I do think it's very important to have that connection. And so, and as an ed leader person, my job, I think, is always to train, to school, basically, the leadership, aspiring leaders to go back into those schools and be the support that you need as a teacher, because there is this whole cultural disconnect. Unfortunately, you probably see yourself in a space of always having to explain. That gets tiring.
Exhausting.
I mean, people need to know, like they have to learn. It's a teachable moment for the adults, but ultimately, that's tiring work, but you gotta keep pushing. So keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you. And Melissa Harris Perry, I talk to my kids about you all the time, so if you want to come hang out with us, feel free.
Okay. I will. Let me just say, I would happily come hang out with y'all. But seriously, if you give me an invitation, I will come. The other thing I'll say is, just because you feel bad does not mean you're failing. So you feel bad because white supremacy and sexism make you feel bad. And so let me just say, like, if at the end of the day you're like, oh my God, I feel awful, I feel sad, it doesn't mean that because like we're all sitting there listening to you talking about it, it's like, well, you actually don't need any advice. What you might need to hear is, yep, yes ma'am, that sucks, Sure, it's okay to have a nap. One glass of wine, not the second. Put that down. Water for the second glass. But like, yes, right? And so if you feel bad, it is not because you're failing at what you're doing, it's just because oppression does in fact feel really bad.
So I just want to take a moment to thank you all for your time, and in particular the black women and girls in the audience. I want to thank you, for being awesome, and that you do matter, you are important, you are special, and let's continue to do the work that we do. Thank you and have a great day.
Check, 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 check. Hello, hello. Welcome. Good afternoon.